official debate happening. We have Jiva, we have Footsoldier. For this debate, Jiva's taking the position that evolution is a religion. Footsoldier's taking the opposition. As always, when we base upon who concedes, if we don't get a vocal concession from either participant, we'll put it to a voting poll in which you, the audience, can decide on who you think performed better overall in the debate. There will be light moderation, no time limit. Thank you both for debating. You can get started.
Great stuff. So, Jiva,
Yeah.
would you like to introduce the proposition, how you see it, and maybe define
Yes.
some goalposts for a concession or for a debate win?
Yeah, sure. So, obviously, the debate proposition, as Stone mentioned, is evolution is a religion. And when I'm talking about evolution, I'm really referring to evolutionary theory. So I understand the definition of evolution, which is a change in phenotype, frequency in a population over time. But I'm not specifically referring to that. I'm referring to evolutionary theory, which is the historical claim that we all descended from a single cell common ancestor. And the fundamental tenet of this theory is speciation, i.e., the idea that all species have evolved from other species, and all species, evolve into other species. Okay, so my position is that I don't think evolutionary theory has been proven to a reasonable degree, such that it should be considered and taught as scientific truth, or any truth for that matter. Now, that's not to say it's untrue. It could be true. I'm just saying that we're not in a position to conclude one way or the other. Much in the same way that we can't prove or disprove the Christian God, we cannot prove or disprove evolutionary theory. And the reason I make this claim is because I see evolutionary theory as a faith and not a science. And I think it's got all the hallmarks of a faith. And I can argue against this from various positions: the scientific position, the evidence position. I can bring up logical arguments against it, and I can also show severe mechanical flaws with the theory. So I don't know if that gives you an idea of where I am and sort of the threshold I would expect to be convinced otherwise. Do you have any
Sure.
questions?
Yeah, would you like to define what you see a religion as being?
Yeah, so now look, I accept that that is somewhat questionable, but I use religion in the proposition title just to spark some interest. But what I mean is just a faith. You could argue it's a faith, so something which doesn't really meet the threshold to be considered a fact. So we could use justified true belief. I mean, I could, because I don't want to really go too much into the philosophy of epistemology here, but I think when it comes to science, I would say there is a scientific threshold which a theory or a hypothesis has to meet to be considered true. And I don't think evolution has met that threshold. And that's why I'm referring to it as a faith, just because it hasn't met the scientific threshold.
Okay, interesting. So, I guess there would have been a very easy open goal if you had defined religion more rigidly in a more commonly accepted view of religion. But I accept the
Yeah.
goalposts for the debate as you've defined them. And for anyone watching or listening after the fact, this was a spare of the moment thing. I haven't prepared for this, and I wasn't really exactly sure on the interpretation of the prop, but I'll go with the interpretation that's been laid
Yeah, I
out.
mean,
So,
thanks, Sergio. That's fair, considerate of you, because I mean, the prop title is a little bit of clickbait as well, isn't it? I mean, want to draw in an audience, so
okay,
it's better than sort of laying out a whole description of what the
yeah.
epistemological thresholds for believing something is true, whatever. So yeah, I'm glad that you accept that, though.
Well, you mentioned that you didn't feel that we needed to get into a discussion on epistemology, but I feel that that's one of the first places we need to visit.
Mhm.
Are you familiar with Gettier cases?
Yes.
Right. So, if we have some standards such as justified true belief, um, and we think that this is therefore a good standard of knowledge, with Gettier cases, we can see that actually this isn't a good standard of knowledge, because you could arrive at something which is true without having any knowledge of that thing. You could have been mistaken. There's various ways that we can construct Gettier case type arguments. We can use the classic um, John with coins in his 15 coins in his
Yeah.
pocket and this sort of thing, or we could also um, do like an analogy of. I've heard one analogy which is quite interesting with Barnesville, it was called or something, and in Barnesville there's all fake barns, and they're actually just
Right.
cardboard fascias of barns, and you're driving past, and you look at it, and it's like, oh, that's a barn, and John thinks that these are all barns, and then he sees a real barn, and he says, oh, well, that's a barn as well, and he's true, it is correct that it's a barn, right? So that is the correct answer, but he's extremely bad at distinguishing real barns from cardboard barns, and so he has no knowledge about what is the cardboard barn and what is not the cardboard barn, and he just stumbles upon coincidence that he just happened to identify the barn that he pointed out last as being the real barn. So it is a problem for knowledge that if you have some standards such as justified true belief, well, Gettier cases show us that this isn't a very good standard for knowledge. So then we need another standard, and we can think, okay, well, what standard can we use? Let's look at something like a table. Does a table exist? It's in front of us. We can see that the table exists. It's right there. It's matter. We can touch it. We know that exists. But what if we are metaphysical skeptics and we want to say, okay, well, what really does exist? Do atoms exist? Do particles really exist? Does matter really exist? If you're a Berkeleyan idealist, you might deny that matter exists. You've got all sorts of types of idealism which would deny the existence of matter. And so when we want to be skeptical about something, we could be so skeptical that we retreat into incoherence. So I could be metaphysically skeptical about the existence of my hands. But by the time I've done that, being so skeptical about something as fundamental to my existence as the existence of my hands, I've just pushed myself into an incoherent world of confusion, and I can no longer communicate as a human. Right at that point, if I'm confused about the existence of my hands, then there's no real basis for me to make any claims about anything in reality, because I'm confused as to something so fundamental to my being as my hands. So there needs to be some line. There needs to be some standard of knowledge. And it seems that you've drawn the line and you've put evolution on one side of it, and you've put other things in science on the other side of it. But how do you define your line?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I understand your questions there, Footsoldier, or at least I think I do. But the issue is that like I said, I don't want to get into sort of a metaphysical issue on knowledge, because I think with science and the scientific methodology, we have to assume or presume certain or accept certain presuppositions and certain axioms. One of them being that we exist, we have a conscious experience. Number two, that our sense organs are reliable, so we're not hallucinating. And number three, that we can gain knowledge of the external empirical universe, right? So if we accept those axioms, right, then science can work, right? Would you accept that? So that's a starting point that I'm coming from. I mean,
Well,
would you agree to that?
I heard the first two, but I'm not sure if it's my internet connection sitting in the park or whether it was yours, but I didn't hear the third.
Yeah, so basically, just the axioms that obviously we exist as conscious beings. There is an empirical universe outside of us as well, right? So I'm not going down idealism or anything like that. And that we have sense perceptions of this empirical universe through which we gain empirical knowledge of it, and that is subject to the scientific. We can put that to the scientific method, and science is a way which we can acquire knowledge of the external universe. Those are the presuppositions I'm starting with. Would you agree to them?
There was a bit of contentiousness in there, in that you say that you can't do science as an idealist. I would reject that. I'd say that you can be an idealist who does science, right?
Yes. No, granted, yeah. No, I'll retract that comment. I accept that as well. But I'm just working on the principle that there is an objective universe, right, which we can measure or learn, experiment with and learn about.
Well, there is at least some shared reality, whether that's material or otherwise. We can study this shared reality, report empirical findings of this shared reality. So yeah, not to get too nitpicky, we can use that as a basis. But if we're just going to have that as a basis, that there exists a shared reality, our sense perceptions aren't deceiving us, and these general common sense things, then we've got those axiomatically. But then when we're doing any inductive inquiry or anything based upon experiential data or anything that's contingent on any form of induction, then we need to ask, is this good enough as well? So Popper thought that it was better to have a theory of or a sense of falsification instead
Mhm.
of trying to, otherwise you're going to be victim of the black swan fallacy, right? So if you
Yeah.
just try and observe what's around you and you say, okay, well, all the swans seem to be white, well, when a black one comes along, then it's going to falsify your theory, but you're going to be like, oh, well, that's not a swan because swans are white. But if you work on the theory of falsification, then you don't run into that fallacy because then you can not prove anything. It's difficult to prove anything because then you're going to require complete knowledge, but at least you can attempt to falsify things, and things seem to be true to the degree that they cannot be falsified, right?
Yes, I completely accept.
Would
I'm
you
actually
agree with
working
that?
on Popper's. Yeah, I'm actually working on Popper's definition of science and his falsification criteria. So I would adhere
Yeah.
to that. Exactly what you just said. That I agree that nothing in science can be proven absolutely certain. Right? It can only be disproven with certainty. Right? But
Yeah.
there is a specific threshold for accepting something as true. So, for example, the helium theory that's met that threshold supposedly. Theory of life, they've all met those thresholds. But my contention is that evolutionary theory has not met that threshold. But in order to go into this in more detail, I think we would need to explore the scientific method and just make sure we both agree with the definition of science. So, would you agree with me in saying that science, this is obviously an oversimplification, but I don't want to get too complicated for it to get too complicated. But essentially, science works on the premise that you make a hypothesis, you make an observation, a general observation about nature, you make a hypothesis, then you test that hypothesis, and you make testable predictions with the hypothesis, and thereby you either verify or falsify. Would you agree with that as a simple explanation of the scientific methodology?
Yep, that'll do for me.
Yeah, okay. So my first contention is evolutionary theory. Now, really, science and induction, right, is used to make generalizations about the present. Okay. Now, the issue with evolutionary theory is it's making a claim about the past, right? And this is a point which some, anti-evolutionists like Ken Ham have made the difference between historical science and operational science, right? But essentially, the claims of the past are history, right? The fact that your ancestor was a bacterium, shall we say, is a historical claim. It's not a scientific claim. So how are you going to address that claim, or prove that claim, or verify that claim, or falsify that claim using the scientific method or induction?
Right. Well, this is the thing. We already agreed that using falsification as a guiding principle in our testability portion of the scientific method, we're never going to absolutely be able to determine the truth. We can only determine the falsity. So, with anything which is a theory and not a theorem, that's not deductively the case, we're never going to be able to prove its validity. And so what we need to do is establish the bar. You've said that there is some theory out there. Well, there are some theories. I didn't exactly hear which they were because my internet connection's crap, and I'm now walking to a better spot for my internet connection. But
Okay.
you say that there are some theories which are accepted as being scientific and not faith-based positions, but evolution is not one of them. And but we've yet to exactly define this threshold. And I feel that the evidence for speciesization and the evolutionary theory is actually available in fossils. We have intermediary fossils that we can see quite clearly. They're called vestigial bones and appendices, which vestigial, I think the word is off the top of my head. Yeah.
Vestigial, yep.
And we can see these types of structures which on intermediary fossils. So we have evidence that there was
Right.
Evolution did take place. Now, if you're going to say that the bar is we need to have evidence of every single step in the evolutionary chain back to bacteria, then that evidence cannot be provided for obvious reasons. But I don't think that's the project of evolutionary science or evolutionary theory, to demonstrate by pointing at some magical evidence which evidences evolution from bacteria. I think the project of evolutionary theory is trying to prove or demonstrate to a very cogent extent that we evolved through a chain of slowly evolving processes over time, and so we've gone from being great apes to the present day, and before that there was ancestors and ancestors before that, and going back through the mammals and the amphibians, and piecing together the picture, right? I don't think anyone needs to turn around and say, look, aha, here's irrefutable evidence that all life came from this cell here, pointing at said cell. I don't think like that is ridiculous. Okay. But so what exactly is the bar? Because I think the project of evolutionary science has been taken up in an amazingly cogent way, to the point that if you're going to come along and say that, oh well, humans didn't have Homo erectus as ancestors, like Homo erectus weren't our ancestors, or Australopithecus wasn't an ancestor. That was like a separate thing. We were put here by God or something like. If you're gonna posit some alternative theory, I don't think you could argue for it as cogently. We have intermediary fossils on, and just completely cogent, persuasive fossil records and evidence to point to our evolution through time. And so that at this point, the evidence is so strong and compelling, I could not possibly consider that faith-based position.
Okay.
But
okay.
Yeah.
Fine.
But if you're saying that the bar is bacteria, then that's just that's just crazy town.
No, okay. Let me clarify my position. Okay, so I think we're moving slightly from the philosophy of science into the actual empirical evidence, which is fine. I'm happy to go there. But I just want to clarify my position on the issue of whether evolutionary theory actually falls under the remit of true science. My belief and position is that it doesn't. And the reason for this is because I think you can separate evolutionary theory into two main claims. One, the historical claim that common descent is true. And second, the scientific claim, which you can analyze with induction, which is species are evolving. Okay. Now, when people think of evolutionary theory, they don't think of the second claim, because that's of no use or no interest to anyone. Who cares if we're going to evolve into another species in 1 million years, right? It's not something that anybody really cares about. We care about the historical claim. Okay. And my argument is that the historical claim can only be approached through adduction, right? It's a historical investigation. You can't use science to establish what happened in the past, right? You can only use science theoretically and the scientific methodology to explain what is happening in the present and subsequently make predictions of the future. But okay, But that's fine. Okay, you can still prove things through history. Think of a criminal court case, right? There's a burden of proof to meet the guilt. The suspect has to meet the burden of proof to be proved guilty. Okay, and you collect evidence to try and establish that case. Similarly, I agree with you. You can collect evidence, historical evidence, to show that we all descended from a single cell common ancestor, right? And I agree with you. It would be too high to set the threshold to say we require evidence of every single transition from that process. Okay, I don't think that's necessary. But I would argue that the threshold has not been met nearly anywhere as high as it should have. So, for example, you mentioned a few species like the genus Australopithecus, and you mentioned Homo erectus. I mean, how are you establishing, right, that those are just fossils in the ground? How are you establishing that you descended from them? Right, we would need a scientific process, a scientific model, an explanation, a sort of a method of causality. I mean, none of that has been provided. So that's what I mean when I say the threshold has not been met. I would
Okay.
actually okay, before I'll just make one final point. I would not only argue that the threshold has not been met for common descent, I would argue that the threshold has not been met for speciation, i.e., the idea that even one species can evolve into a new species. But I'll let you respond before continuing with
Yeah,
that.
sure. So it feels like there's two main points on the table from that now, and I think this is everything else we've discussed nicely through. But the two main points on the table now are going to be um, the fact of the scientific process being applied historically. Can we make novel predictions about things in the past?
Mhm.
Or we can't, because that's not what a novel prediction would be if it already happened. So yeah, sure.
Well,
We
but
can.
sorry, I'll just interrupt there to just clarify. That's my position as well. But most evolutionists will argue you can make testable predictions about the past because you're predicting your discovery of the event. Would you disagree with them? So let's say, for example, they say, I predict I will find an ape man fossil in Kenya, right? And then they go dig and search for that fossil and they find it and they say, look, our predictions come true. That's a testable prediction. Therefore, evolutionary theory is scientific. But would you disagree with them there, or are you agreeing with me that that's not a novel testable prediction?
No, I'd just say that that's a different category of things, right? So this is what I was going to get to. I was going to say that we have. So to make a novel prediction about something that's going to happen in the future, then you can't look to the past, but you can look, yeah, for example, to excavation hopes, right? Yeah, as you just explained. But what I was also going to say, so there's two things on the table. There's this, and there's also the dispute between the intermediary fossils, or how the intermediary fossils um, could be scientifically verified to be um, in a lineage and not just random different species that look like they evolved, but there's no actual reason to think that they were part of an evolutionary chain. So they're the 2 points I see on the table.
Mhm.
In terms of testing novel predictions, you already like that was one of the answers that I was going to have. Um, you can, as you just explained, the prediction itself could be the discovery. But I was also going to say there's another way to make testable novel predictions, and Darwin did it, right? So in Darwin's original observations, um, he observed. Didn't he observe a type of bird that evolved in a certain way? Like he witnessed some evolutionary event, right? In I can't remember the details off the top of my head, but it's
Yeah,
even yeah, right. So
it,
it was with
but,
birds.
but wait, I'll just correct you one point there. You said he witnessed the evolutionary event. He didn't witness the evolutionary event. He predicted that he would find a species that had these characteristics, and he found the species. The species didn't evolve while he was observing it. Do you see what I mean? So it's not. He's predicted a discovery of a past event there.
Right, but there's I can't remember the exact details because this is just off the top of my head and I've not gone over any notes for the preparation. I just spontaneously accepted the debate. So this is all off the top of my head. But there, Darwin. I thought Darwin predicted something with birds, but he saw. It might not have been Darwin actually, but I thought that there was like a coexistence of different levels of the different stages of the evolution, because there was some vestigial element that was evidenced. But anyway, that aside, even if it wasn't Darwin, there are cases of modern day evolution. Sorry, there's someone going by on a loud lawnmower thing in the gardens here. Yeah, so there is modern day evidence of evolution being observed, right? Because you've got these weird phenomena where you'll get some sort of predator introduction or invasive species introduction, and you'll see certain species change over the course of a few decades. At this point, I'm just going off the top of my head. I'll need to start Googling, and I'm in the middle of the park on my phone. Maybe you can help me out. Maybe you've actually encountered some of these. But there is actual modern day evidence for evolution, not just making predictions on discoveries, but seeing evolution happen.
Yes, okay. So, Footsoldier, I will help you out. As far as I can tell, evolutionary theory does not make any meaningful predictions about events that will happen in the future. They can only predict discoveries of events that have already happened. So, for example, evolutionary theory cannot take any of the 1.2 million species in existence today and tell us what it will evolve into next. Why can't it? Because it's got no workable scientific model. It's got no way of predicting what will happen, what random mutations will occur, what features will arise from these, and how the reproductive isolation and speciation event will occur. It can't predict any of that, right? So all the predictions are made about past events, right? Of course, you can make a prediction that a bacteria will develop antibiotic resistance if you apply, but that's not really what is meant by a testable prediction, and that's not in reference to speciation, right? So it can't tell us anything. It can't make any meaningful prediction, which is testable, observable, and falsifiable.
Right. Well, I'm just gonna have to start Googling on my phone then, because there are examples that I've seen before. Evolution.
While you're doing that, I will say, look, my position on this is quite nuanced, and not many people agree with me, right? Because I think the definition of science has been altered quite a lot. Philosophy of science. I think Karl Popper would agree with me probably, right? Because he actually concluded himself that evolution was not a scientific theory, but a metaphysical research program. Okay, granted, he later changed his mind, as evolutionists are quick to point out, but he only changed his mind on natural selection, not on speciation and evolution. Natural selection is very different to speciation. Right? Natural selection, I don't think anyone would dispute natural selection, right? If I go around saying I'm going to kill or exterminate all people with, green eyes, then it's no surprise that people with green eyes will go out of existence, right? That's all natural selection is. But speciation, the process where one species can give rise to another species, is the very question which is being addressed by evolutionary theory, and that's the question which has not been proven to a reasonable degree.
Right. Well, you've got obvious cases of hold on. So I'm just googling about now, but there's I've encountered actual evidence in the past, and I'm trying to recall it, but I can't. It's something to do with birds and something to do with like insects.
Right.
Direct observation. We can directly observe small-scale evolution in organisms with short life cycles, e.g., pesticide-resistant insects. There are actual observations which have been made of evolution in like frogs and shit. Like, this is vague, and I apologize for being vague because I'm just in the park. And
no, I
this
appreciate
was
that.
spontaneous. But so if for example, if I was to find one observation of evolution, would that be within the goalpost of a defeater for part of your claim?
Certainly, yeah. It would be a starting point. I don't know if it would defeat the whole claim, but it would certainly be a starting point, right? But one thing I just want to clarify, somebody in the chat has written there's no robust definition of species. So I will actually provide a robust definition of species, right? So that we can both work from this framework. So I would define species as a group of organisms that can successfully reproduce with each other, okay, but not with organisms outside the group. And when I'm talking about successful reproduction, I'm talking about the ability to produce fertile, viable offspring. Okay. And when we observe nature today, let's stick to the animal kingdom because things get a bit complicated when you bring in, asexually reproducing organisms and plants and bacteria. But with the animal kingdom today, that is a very clear and robust distinction. I think we hardly see any examples which fall outside of that definition, right? There are a few like hybrids, like a horse and a donkey are different species, but they can produce offspring. But I would argue they don't produce fertile offspring, right? So that's not an example of successful reproduction. So are you happy, Footsoldier, with that definition of species?
It seems to be a bit of a contentious one, but I'll grant it for now just to get the conversation moving. There's
Yeah, because I don't see it as I don't see it as contentious though, because unless you can provide me with some examples of animals that cross that line and you can't tell which species they belong to, then I don't see. So, for example, dogs, I would classify all dogs as the same species, along with wolves and coyotes, right? Because they can all successfully reproduce with one another. Technically, they might not do it in practice because of mechanical reasons or geographical reasons, right? But technically, if artificial insemination methods were used, they would be able to produce fertile offspring.
right, but you've got like donkeys and horses
Yeah,
who give birth to mules, right?
yeah,
Is that
which are
right?
mules are infertile.
Right. So, but
99% of the time, anyway. Yeah.
they're different. They're a mule um is the viable offspring from two different species.
No, that's why I said in my definition of speciation, it would have to be fertile and viable offspring.
Ah, okay, yeah. So
So
the
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 mule
next
can't
generation,
reproduce and
yeah,
continue
the next
the
generation,
lineage.
yeah. Right. So I'm just trying to because there's problems.
You see, yeah, I'll explain something to you. So basically, speciation. Now, this is where I think a lot of people have been sort of fooled to a large degree. Speciation has not clearly been proven. Well, in fact, I don't think speciation has been proven at all. Right, 100 years and 600 generations of fruit fly breeding has not yielded clear evidence of speciation. All they can produce is deformed fruit flies, infertile fruit flies, right? But they've not been able to actually produce a new species of fruit flies. Similarly, they've not been able to do this in any species, even species where artificial breeding has been happening for hundreds or thousands of years, like dogs, cattle, horses, rabbits. They've never produced a new species, like a new type, which cannot interbreed with the old type, right? Um, so for me, the threshold for establishing whether speciation is even possible would be they would have to demonstrate an example of speciation in nature, or at least provide evidence that it's feasible. Because as far as I can see, there's not even any evidence to suggest it's possible.
Right. Well, I've seen evidence of it, but I think if we're gonna go down this conversation of purely empirical evidence and I have to provide examples, I'm not equipped to do it in the park, Googling on my phone, because I
Yeah,
can't concentrate reading the articles and listening to what you're saying at the same time. It's just I would need to go away and look at that evidence. So um, I personally have seen examples, compelling examples of direct observation of evolutionary processes, and I've seen compelling evidence of. You can just watch like Richard Dawkins has made various videos just demonstrating very cogently how there is evidence for um, evolutionary theory, how the intermediary fossils are very, very compelling. Like he's made various videos. I've watched these videos in the past, and unless there's some huge conspiracy where this is all fake,
Mhm.
and Richard Dawkins it has just like completely deluded or completely brainwashed me or something, then
Yeah.
there does appear to be evidence which I think you might be deliberately overlooking or not.
Well, yeah, I
Yeah.
don't believe it's a big conspiracy, right? Necessarily, okay, but I do believe it's based. This whole theory is based in naturalistic philosophy, right? So it's the idea that, and as you know, Darwin came along only 160 years ago with this idea, um, and his idea gained huge popularity and huge momentum. Why? Because of its effect on religion. As I think, as the famed agnostic Robert Ingersoll said, Darwin really, you know, put the final nail in the coffin of Orthodox Christianity, right?
Mm.
Because it was because that was a big problem for atheism and naturalism. They couldn't explain the origin of life, or the origin of species, right? So he comes along with this theory, produces it, and it gains huge momentum and huge support from naturalists. And you can see that someone like Richard Dawkins is a huge naturalist, a huge atheist. So of course he's going to support the theory. Of course he's going to promote it. Of course he's going to interpret data and observations in a way which fits in with his preconceived bias. That's the whole point. But I could argue against every single piece of evidence evidence he produces, and give an alternative explanation. Now, you said, for example, transition from one type to another, right? If you take a simple evolutionary lineage, let's say the common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans, right, to modern humans, how many transitional species should there be in that gap? Would you say?
Well, it depends on what you're defining as the transition. Like it could be any number.
Yeah, well, distinct species. When I say how many transitional species should there be between that common ancestor of the chimpanzee and the human being and the human being?
Wait, I don't know. It
Yeah,
depends on evolution. It depends on
yeah.
how it is. It's just
No one knows.
it's
Yeah,
going to
you're
be
right.
like just nomologically the the case of what it is.
Yeah. So you're right. Good answer. You don't know, and nobody knows, because really speaking, science should be able to produce a number if it's going to work on the principle that that's happened, right?
Why?
Then you would expect that, but the number is, it would presumably have to be dozens, if not hundreds. How much evidence have they? How many species have they discovered in the ground? Probably four, five, maybe. And would you say that's met the threshold? Then is that good evidence? Four species out of presumably hundreds. I mean, I would argue that's probably not met the threshold, and that's not very good evidence.
Well, look, you seem to forgive me if this is a false characterization of what you're doing, but you seem to be making a bit of a new error in thinking that you've got discrete species which are like digitally, yes, this is species A, this is species B, this is species C. And but what is more likely and what we see in nature is divergences, and the further it diverges away from the original, the less capable of it is of interbreeding, to the point where
Okay, so
then ultimately
well,
cannot
that's a big
interbreed.
claim. Okay, that's a big claim, Footsoldier. Can you back it up with any examples?
What? So you think that the evolutionary process, so small incremental changes over hundreds and thousands of years, it would be like bang, like there would be like the ancestor, the next ancestor. So like ancestor 434 is cool, but then ancestor 435, bash, like that's a new species now. It can't interbreed with the previous. Like of course not. That's not how it
Yeah,
works. It's going
yeah,
to
I
be a
agree.
gradual. It's going to be a gradient, and
Yeah,
then the further the bigger the divergence, the um the bigger the divergence, you're going to have for example, geographical isolation or separation between an ancestor, and it's going
mhm,
to diverge differently, right? And and at some point, they're going to be far enough away that they can't interbreed. Maybe some can interbreed. Maybe it's some threshold. Maybe some can, some can't. And then at some point,
right.
none can.
So would you would you argue then that, for example, the Aborigines of Australia before 250 years ago were a different species, or were on their way to becoming a different species to white Europeans on those
Uh,
grounds?
well, me and you are on our way to becoming a different species, right?
Well,
If we isolate
that's
each other.
that's an unfounded claim. You haven't got any evidence to support. That's begging the question, isn't it? That's the very thing we're trying to answer. But are
Well,
you saying,
I wasn't begging the question. I was just talking axiomatically about like we're using the axiom of evolution. Yeah, right. But is begging the debate proposition. But I meant like in the context of if we're talking about evolution, and that would happen in the paradigm of
mm,
evolution, right? So of course it's
yeah,
begging the question in regards to the debate proposition, but that's not what I really meant. I meant like if
yeah.
we are to
I,
accept evolution, then everything's divergent. The flowers that I see in front of me are divergent from some other flowers which are supposedly the same
Yeah,
genus
foot
in
soldier.
another part.
Yeah, foot soldier. I actually understand your point on reproductive isolation, geographical separation. In fact, one of what somebody's posted in the chat as well, that you might want to put the caveat for the reason why species or types can't produce fertile offspring, right? And there is this distinction between pre-zygotic um, reproductive isolation and post-zygotic reproductive isolation, right? I won't complicate matters now with that. But the issue I'm making is that if you're going to claim that geographical separation leads towards speciation, I would want you to provide me examples of where you can show that two types of a species that are separated, like let's take a lost tribe in the Amazon rainforest and us in Britain. Right? I would want you to show me evidence that we are on our way to becoming different species, and the way you would provide that evidence is by showing that the fertility rates between us and them are less than fertility rates just within our own communities. Has that been demonstrated? Because I've looked for that evidence and it's not there. There's no evidence to say that interracial fertility is less than intraracial fertility, right? And that's a phenomenon we see with all species, not just the human species. Even the dog species, there's no evidence to suggest that two chihuahuas have lower fertility than a chihuahua and a Great Dane do if artificial insemination methods are used. So I don't see the evidence for reproductive isolation leading to speciation, but maybe you could fill me in if there is some that you're aware of.
Right, but you've sort of when you start talking about artificial insemination, you're just saying, "Oh, don't worry about the physical aspects of it. Don't worry about the mechanical aspects. Let's just say, oh no, it's can produce viable offspring if we go into the lab." Well, then, okay, well we can go into the lab with infertile humans, and then we say, okay, they're fertile. So going into the lab can close the gap on the divergence. It can't transcend the gap when the gap's too large, right? You can't.
No, because when you're talking about infertile humans, you're talking about one or two individual members of a species. I'm talking about the species as a whole. Of course, you'll get one or two people who are infertile within any population, right? But when we're making generalizations about the population as a whole, now you can't go into a lab, right, and create a baby with a human and a chimpanzee's right reproductive gametes, right? So that's because we're different species to a chimpanzee, right? But
Right,
you can
because
take two humans and
the divergence is too large. But actually, there is conspiratorial evidence that it's happened. I don't know how compelling I find that. I'm erring on the side of it didn't happen, but the Russians get up to all sorts of funny things, and maybe it did. But yeah, that's not something
yeah.
I'd actually argue for in this debate. But I think there, I think there we're going to have a problem with ethics, medical ethics, right? Research ethics rather than actual saying, "Oh, it's not possible." Well, how do you know it's not possible when it's prohibitive? It's prohibited to actually research, right? There's and the research projects that I've looked at have supposedly produced viable offspring, but we won't know because it's actually banned. So if
Well,
you
it's banned for humans, right? But I'm sure they won't have any problems doing it with insects or small mammals, and they've not done it. They've not been able to prove that they can create a viable offspring from two distinct species, even with artificial insemination. So I don't see this gradation which would be required in order to prove the process of speciation, or even
Right,
make the, you know, give credit
right.
to
Well,
it.
this is the thing. Like it, because there's no rigid definition of what species really is. You're gonna get you're gonna run into a problem where I might just assert that a Chihuahua is a different species from a Great Dane, but but um, but then it's like you're going to say no, they're the same species. So how do we resolve that, right?
Well,
So
we resolve it by using my definition, isn't it? Because I produced a definition which was universally accepted before evolutionary theory came along. Right? Now, evolutionary theory has come and changed the definition because it fits in with their paradigm. Right? But if you accept the standard definition, which is a common sense definition, right? Organisms that can interbreed with each other to produce fertile offspring belong to the same species. We don't see any exceptions in nature. That's the funny thing. And a couple of questions in the side chat: are wolves and dogs different species? No, they're not. They're the same species. Are lions and tigers the same species? No, lions and tigers are different species because when they reproduce very randomly, or well, through human intervention, they produce an infertile liger, I believe it's called.
liger, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So I guess where we are at in the conversation is you're saying there's no evidence of crossing the species barrier. I am
Yeah.
struggling to provide evidence from the top of my head, uh, and I guess we'll need empirical evidence to solve that.
Yeah.
We could postpone that empirical evidence because I'm pretty sure I've watched Richard Dawkins' videos about him providing such evidence. But now, if you're going to say, well, none of that's compelling, I can debunk it all, then maybe
Yeah.
you're
Well,
right. Maybe you're right, but I would have to see you actually do that for the
mhm.
evidence that I've watched, the YouTube videos that I've watched. And if you are to adequately debunk Richard Dawkins providing the evidence that I believed was persuasive, then maybe I'd concede that point. I don't think it's fatal to the conversation as a whole, though, because I feel like there's multiple things on the table, and only one of them seems to be a dead end right now because I just don't have the empirical evidence in front of me because I'm in the park
Mhm.
and it's raining and I'm holding my umbrella. And so it's a bit is not happening
Yeah.
on that front.
Well,
But
yeah.
the other thing on the table, the other thing on
Yeah.
the table is just the methodology, because the debate proposition we've gone, it's been very interesting to discuss the speciesization. That's very interesting to discuss, but the debate proposition itself is actually whether the theory of evolution is akin to a religion, or we
Mhm.
can interpret that on your view, your broader sense, as a faith-based position. Now, if it is the case that there is absolutely no evidence that the species barrier, um, or that there's ever been species divergence observed, there's no evidence for species divergence whatsoever, then it would be a faith-based position. So,
Yeah.
in that sense, um, in terms of the methodology, um, the falsification. Yeah, I think the main thing that we're going to run into right now is I need to provide empirical evidence for the claim of species divergence.
Yeah, okay, but let me just clarify something, Footsoldier. You said if there is no solid evidence for speciation, then you would concede that evolution is a faith, right? I'll clarify that's what you said, right?
No, I would concede that speciation, the theory concerning speciation, is a faith based position at that point. I'm not sure if that would concede the proposition of evolutionary theory as a whole
But if
being a
we're saying,
being
but
faith based.
speciation is the vital mechanism for evolution to take place, common descent to take place, isn't it? Right? If we've all descended from this single cell common ancestor, it's happened through the process of speciation. Therefore, if you say there's no evidence for speciation and speciation is subsequently a faith, then the whole of evolutionary theory crumbles, doesn't it? The whole theory becomes a faith.
Right.
Just
I'm just trying to get my head around whether the whether the points you're saying about the interbreeding and definition of species and stuff like this, like whether that is actually necessary for the theory, right? Because we've got intermediary fossils, we've got all these things to show that different species changed over time, they evolved over time, but now you're
Well,
just
that
saying,
doesn't show that. You're inferring that.
yeah, we're inferring that, but now you're saying that because there's no current evidence from observed speciation, directly observed speciation, there's no current evidence that it would be a faith-based position to say that evolution took place in the way that it did, and to conclude that the intermediary fossils were a result of evolution and they weren't just discrete beings that God placed upon the earth that died out consecutively,
Yes,
right?
because
So,
for me, yes, because for me, I think the threshold would be they have to maybe not demonstrate speciation in entirety, but at least show some evidence for it. Like I said, show a gradation of reducing fertility between different types of a species. That would be
right,
evidence in. But before you because I know you said you don't have the evidence to hand of speciation, so I will highlight that they do present certain examples, like for example the Californian salamanders and the gall wasps and North American hawthorn fly and also the London underground mosquito, right? These are the cases in nature that they describe and say use as evidence for speciation. But the problem is none of these have been observed prospectively, right? They've come in after the fact, observed two different types within a group and said, oh, speciation has occurred, but they haven't observed speciation occurring. So that's why I say that wouldn't constitute scientific evidence. But the other issue
are
is,
you sure? Are you sure that they haven't observed it occurring? Because I've seen Richard Dawkins say, and this is an appeal to Richard Dawkins. I understand that, but that's why I'm
invite
not
your
gonna
bond.
right appeal to Richard Dawkins fallacy. But this, I've heard Richard Dawkins say that there's been these birds were observed over a number of decades to evolve in some way. And I watched this video years ago, so I can't comment on the specifics. But it was a direct observation. Now, what I need to do is go away and find these clips and then present you with the evidence for that
That's
of
fine
the
for
observation.
yeah,
And
that's fine.
if it is the case that Dawkins is chatting shit, then I'll concede that point. And whether this has anything to do with the debate or not, or just some post-debate interesting
Yeah,
interaction, I don't mind. But I'm going to go away and have a look at that. And
fine,
if Richard Dawkins is chatting shit, then I'll come back to you and say, okay, I believe that point. If he's
fine.
not
The
chatting
example
shit, then
might
that's
be
evidence to refute it.
fine, Footsoldier. The example you might be referring to is there was a finch study done by a couple on the Galapagos a few decades ago, I
Yeah,
believe,
yeah.
and
Finches sound familiar. It might have been that.
yeah,
What's the defeater for that then?
yeah, but I would argue that wasn't actually evident. What they're producing there is hybridization, right? It's not actually evidence of speciation. Remember, speciation, right, is an event which reportedly happens over thousands of years, thousands of generations, tens of thousands of years, if not millions of years. So theoretically, it becomes very difficult to observe in nature. Granted, I accept that. Even James Mallet, who is a Harvard-based evolutionary biologist and who has written extensively on speciation, he accepts and concedes that we can't really observe speciation in nature. We can observe reproductive isolation, which is the forerunner of speciation, but we can't observe speciation. And my
Right,
contention is that we don't know that reproductive isolation is the forerunner of speciation. That's a presumption based on the theory itself. So it's circular reasoning. It's not proof of speciation. It would be
right,
it would be like me saying, right? It would be like me saying a sleigh, right, is evidence that Santa Claus exists. It's not, is it? The sleigh is necessary for Santa Claus to travel the sky, but the sleigh in and of itself is not evidence that Santa Claus exists. Similarly, reproductive isolation is not evidence in and of itself that speciation occurs.
right. I don't really 100% accept the Santa analogy, but I see what you're getting at. Right. So the problem we're getting into here is I see two diverging things. One thing that we're really interested in talking about right now, which is evidence for species divergence being directly observed. And I know it takes thousands of years, but with evolutionary pressure, it can speed up. And I think that
Correct.
was what was happening with the finches, right? So I need to look into that. As I say, I'm going to look into that and come back to you. But that isn't that. Although that's very interesting, and I've enjoyed discussing that with you because you've you've awoken an interest in me going
Mhm.
away and researching that more, and I thought maybe you've got a point with that. But I don't think that's fatal to the debate proposition, because your claim is that evolutionary theory is a faith-based position. Now, when we are presented with multiple accounts of um, plausible explanations for how we have different species, and we we have to have a more plausible. Hold on a second. Just a van going past. We have to have a more plausible theory, or we would have to have an equally plausible theory, or some theory which is even in the ballpark of plausibility, right? So, although I do need to go away and look at species divergence more closely,
Mhm.
I don't think that's almost irrelevant to the debate proposition if we can establish it's the most likely scientific explanation, because not
Great point.
everything, because we've already agreed earlier in the debate, before we
Mhm.
had the interesting conversation about the evidence, the empirical findings,
Mhm.
we've already had the theoretical discussion, philosophical philosophy of science discussion of how
Mm.
the problem of induction, and how even using a Popperian falsification um, perspective, we are not going to find irrefutable proof for anything. We can only find irrefutable falsification. So,
Mhm.
given
Yeah.
that we can't be certain about everything, if there is an explanation which is overwhelmingly more plausible and
Mhm.
overwhelmingly more fitting, and overwhelmingly just it fits like a glove, but there's missing links, wouldn't we, using Occam's razor and using common sense and using every other inference, that any other type of strength of inference that we would use within science, just to say, well,
Mhm.
the the glove fits the shoe fits the foot, right? It fits. This is the most plausible explanation. What have you got against having the most plausible explanation? And if you think it's not the
Yeah.
most plausible explanation, I'm very interested to hear a more plausible explanation that doesn't include
Yeah.
fairies and God.
Sure, I'll produce one now, and I'll base it in naturalism as well. But
Okay.
just back to your point, I think the reason I think speciation is important is it's because it provides the actual mechanism for this transition, right? So if you have two fossils in the ground, Homo erectus and then Homo sapiens, and you're saying one transitioned into the other, you do need a scientific mechanism to make that claim. Okay, that's the first point I'll make. But the second issue on Occam's razor, right? Now, look, I can provide an equally viable naturalistic hypothesis to explain this phenomena, these observations, as evolutionary theory, as speciation. So, for example, if I found Homo erectus in the ground, and it's a million years old, and I found Homo sapiens, existing today, I could just argue that let's take an alien creation hypothesis. Let's say that an extraterrestrial species of superior intelligence periodically visits planet Earth, causes extinction of species and recreation of a new type of species, right? They don't use biological reproduction or speciation, they do it in a laboratory. So let's say they come to planet Earth through means which we don't understand, they cause mass extinction of Homo erectus, and then in a laboratory they create us, Homo sapiens, and then seed planet Earth with this new species. And they do this periodically over time so that you get mass extinction processes and mass generation processes. In fact, the evidence in the fossil record does suggest, as Stephen Jay Gould points out, sudden, stasis with sudden appearance. So it fits that model as well. Now, the question is, what evidence do you have for your claim that Homo erectus evolved or transitioned into Homo sapiens versus my claim that an alien species did it? Right? Because I would argue they're both equally parsimonious. Neither has any empirical evidence to support them. So either both of them are equally viable. And in
Do
science,
do you
okay,
legitimately think that they're equally parsimonious?
of course, because why wouldn't they be? Only naturalistic philosophy. Well, even naturalistic philosophy doesn't come into this, because I could say the aliens are created naturalistically as well. There's no sort of supernatural processes going on here, right? Many Americans believe aliens have visited planet Earth. I think
Right.
latest
Do
poll I
they
think was only
live?
a third of them.
Live in trailer parks? But
No,
yeah, no.
they didn't mention that on the survey. But look, my point is, Footsoldier, that in order for a scientific hypothesis to become a theory, it has to be the strongest hypothesis, right? It has to stand out. In the same way the criminal justice system works, you can't, if you've got two suspects, independent suspects, right, for a crime, you can't convict one of them, right, because there would be reasonable doubt. Okay, you
Yeah,
can't meet
of
the burden
course,
of proof. Right. So
of
similarly
course.
here, yeah. So similarly here, I would argue my alien hypothesis is equally viable, right, as your speciation hypothesis. Why? Because neither of us has any direct evidence to support our position.
Right. Well, what I would do, I could point out. So what I would do, I would point out two things. I would point out firstly how the alien hypothesis is less parsimonious, and secondly, how the evolution theory um, is a better fit and there's more
Mhm.
evidence for. Right. So with the evolution theory, all you need to all you need to grant is there are missing links, right, to understand the transitions, but we have plenty of evidence of the transitions with fastigial. I can't remember the word. Fastigial.
Yeah, vestigial structures, but
Yeah,
that's not
structures.
evidence. Yeah.
That's not what. Sorry.
That's not evidence, because how does that prove the transition? I mean, I could just argue the aliens create. Sometimes they make mistakes. They're not. They're incompetent. You know, they're
Right.
not.
Right. So we've got. So firstly, you're going to say that the aliens come down, and you've got no evidence for the aliens apart from people who live in trailers. You've the aliens come down intermittently, but even since, right, so we've got species extinction happening left, right, and center. So maybe it happened in addition to the aliens coming down. But let's just say that the aliens came down and that's how the evolution takes place, because every 10,000 or 100,000 years or million years, probably more like every 50,000 to 100,000 years, they come down and create a new intermediate species that's slightly different from the last, iteratively from the last, right? But they would
Mhm.
also not only have to do that with human beings, but all of the millions of different species around the entire world, and they would have to mass extinct all of the types of birds and all of the types of insects and all of the types of flowers and all of the everything. We'd have to come down and just do all of this shit for everything, and do all of these intermediary things and take notes uh, and sort of make all these, synthesize all these intermediaries. We have no evidence of a single visit of an alien. We have no
Well, no,
evidence
okay.
of
Well, not
any of this.
necessarily foot soldier, not necessarily, right? Because the concept that there have been 5 billion species in existence is a product of evolutionary theory itself, right? I'm not saying there have been. Perhaps the aliens don't. There weren't 5 billion species, right? Because we don't have evidence of 5 billion species. So perhaps they don't have to cause all these extinction events, as you say. And
Well,
granted,
we have evidence that we have evidence of millions of different types. Well, I don't know how many examples of fossils we have, but
no,
we have
I
a
believe
large amount of fossils.
No, I believe it's 250,000 transitional fossils have been found. So that's 0.005% of the so-called tree of life. I wouldn't call that exceptional evidence myself, but many people think it
Wait,
is.
it's
But
quite a few.
at
Even
the
if
start, we did
so,
say that this alien species is of extremely high intelligence. You know, an intelligence that we can't conceive of. The same way that the termites can't conceive of your intelligence, we can't conceive of this alien species intelligence. So they use means by which we can't understand, we can't comprehend. But
right.
I'm not into supernaturalism here. They still are a product of naturalism.
Right, but it seems at this point that it's analogous to God.
No, I said I'm not appealing to supernaturalism.
Yeah, I
You know,
know you're not. I know you're not. But what you're doing is you're creating an omniscient, omnipotent being who can travel faster than the speed of light and who can make micro adjustments to every single animal and every single plant on the whole of the earth. And uh, yeah. So at this point, what
true,
you're doing is saying, "Oh no, it's not God. It's omnipotent
true.
and it's omniscient, but it's not God." It's like, okay, well, you're just describing God.
True, foot soldier, but you're appealing to a magical process as well, speciation, which has never been proven or shown. So I don't think we're doing anything different. But I do want, for the record, I do want to point out that this isn't my personal belief. I'm just producing the example of aliens as a to show
Yeah.
that, that there is a
Well,
viable
I
alternative.
think I've demonstrated that it's significantly less parsimonious because you'd have to generate evidence of alien invasions. The aliens would have to be concerned and equipped to modify every single living creature and every single plant, flora, and fungi, and all of everything on the planet, and be able to just annihilate all of it and then create a new iterative version of it. And at that point, you're essentially using God as a defeater for the theory of evolution, which you can do, but it's analogous with God. So it's less parsimonious to posit an omnipotent, omniscient race of aliens who are interested in performing this experiment. Like, why would they have this motive? Why would they come to like all of these things? You would have to provide an account of all of these things, and I'm not going to get you right now on the spot to do that because it would just seem like crazy, like story, like some sort of like I've seen alien invasions. They landed in my lawn. Like all this sort. It's just going to be ridiculous. Like so, it's not only significantly less parsimonious, but it it doesn't even sound in the ballpark similarly plausible to, oh look, we have intermediary fossils. Clearly, this whale came from this uh, creature and this creature and this creature. We can see the evolution from this whale from that to that,
Yeah,
and we see the transition. Oh, we don't quite understand um, the the missing links of the species divergence. We don't quite understand the mechanisms there. We're still working on it, but that seems the shoe seems to fit.
yeah, so foot soldier, my point is that yes, you're picking up these quote intermediate fossils, and you're claiming the transition from them to current forms. Now, my question is, what evidence do we have for that transition? Can you prove it to me? Can you even produce a scientific model to demonstrate how it could have happened? And you can't, right? And therefore, that's why I'm saying believing in that process is a faith because it's not based on any empirical data. It's not based on any evidence. It's not even based on a scientific model, right? So me invoking an alien species to account for that transition, so-called transition, is no different from you invoking naturalism or speciation to account for that transition. Both are faiths, right? Both rely on belief in something which hasn't
Right,
been proven to a reasonable degree, something which cannot be demonstrated. So that's
right
why
now.
I'm
Now,
arguing this is a faith by theory.
if
By,
the
sorry, by
debate
definition.
if the debate proposition was something like science is defined as this specific thing
Mhm.
and evolutionary theory is unscientific, then maybe you would have a winning debate prop if someone took you up on that, because you could just say, oh, well, I've defined it as such and so this is unscientific. But your claim is not that it's unscientific. Your claim is that it's a religion or faith-based position, right?
Yeah.
So it, I don't even have to agree whether it's scientific or not. I could say, okay, I just grant that it's, by your standard, it's unscientific. I can just grant that all day long, and I don't care about that. For
Right. Okay. For
the
soldier,
goalpost, yeah.
let's just sorry to interrupt, but let's just think about that for a moment. So, for example, if somebody said to you, I believe in the resurrection of Christ. I have evidence for it. I've got testimonial accounts for it. There's some literature. There's some written records. There's other pieces of evidence. Would you say that's faith, or would you say that's still is that evidence?
I
Evidence
would
based
say that,
deduction? Hmm?
or I would say the quality of your evidence is clearly crap, right? So it would be like
Agree.
me saying, yeah, look, I would be like saying, oh, I saw a flying saucer yesterday, and you'd be like, oh, right, and you write to the Daily Mail and say, well, my mate saw a flying saucer, therefore the flying saucer was in Wolverhampton or something.
Yeah.
Like, that's just poor evidence, right?
Yeah.
So
So what is your evidence that the single cell common ancestor descended into all organisms, all species? I mean, do you think you've got a stronger threshold of evidence then for that?
well, we have to go step by step, right? So it seems like a big leap, but we can see. I've mentioned now quite a few times, and we understand the intermediary fossils. But it's like, for example, if if I saw footprints through like a muddy garden, like footprints, a broken window, and then dirty, muddy footprints through a house into the kitchen to the cookie jar, and then cookie crumbs everywhere, and then I saw footprints leaving the back door. Right? It's like I'm going to say, oh, well, someone broke in, ate all my cookies, and left out the back door. We can see the footprints, we can see everything that's happened, and you're coming up to me and saying, "Oh no, where's your mechanism for connecting the footprints? How do you know
But
these
you do,
crumbs
but,
didn't get there by
Footsoldier,
aliens? Aliens came down.
Footsoldier.
Aliens came down and put the crumbs there. Aliens came down and painted the footprints on the floor. There wasn't really a person who came and ate these cookies and broke into my house to eat cookies. No, it was aliens. That's a more
Okay.
equally plausible explanation. So you see how, if we
Yes.
just,
Fair
by
point.
analogy, how
But
ridiculous it would be to posit some, when we can see the transitions, we see the footsteps, we see the intermediary things, for you to posit some additional other explanation, some alternative explanation involving aliens, which is, as I've pointed out, less parsimonious. It doesn't fit as well. It
okay,
doesn't matter
your,
if we
foot,
know the
your footprint,
mechanisms or
your
not.
footprint, your footprint analogy is disanalogous because with that, right, we can use reasonable abduction, and you can provide an exact mechanism. So you can say man entered house with muddy feet, with muddy shoes, and left these footprints. So you can give a causal mechanism for all those observations, right? But you can't provide me with a causal mechanism for how Homo erectus changed into Homo sapiens. Maybe
Yes, I can.
maybe I'm wrong. Give me one now.
I can in the same way.
Tell me what
Yeah.
mutations occurred. Tell me
So
what mutations occurred, what morphological changes arose from these mutations, why those changes were favored by nature, leading to
right. So
reproductive adaptation, how the speciation event occurred. Produce a scientific model that a physicist could recognize or an engineer could implement. That's what science is about, causal mechanisms.
right. So the mechanism, the causal mechanism that we see is Homo erectus had sex with one of the female. The male had sex with the female, Homo erectus, and then out popped another one. And then
Yeah.
that happened again, and out popped another one. And then that happened again, and out popped another one. And then, after many years, it changed slightly each time.
How
And
many
now
years?
we're at
How many
Homo.
years?
So 100. Is it not 100,000? It's more than Homo. Is it
Yeah.
100,000? It's
Yeah. The point I'm making is they don't know. Yeah, but they say
no.
Homo erectus.
Yeah, no, but
millions.
yeah, but we've got carbon dating. We've got
Carbon dating goes back 70,000 years.
well, we can carbon date the intermediaries from Homo erectus. And no, not from Australopithecus. No, carbon dating goes back more than 70,000 years. That's a conspiracy theory, actually.
No.
You can
It's
carbon date.
approximately
You can,
70,000. You have to use other radiometric techniques for
yeah, no,
dating.
you've got radio carbon dating. You've got all sorts of different. You can carbon date in. There's many different methods, and there's different reference standards, but they're all within some ballpark of accuracy. Whether it's plus minus however percent.
You still haven't provided the mechanism. All you've said is they have sex, one pops out, they have sex again, another pops out. I want a scientific causal mechanism. What mutations
Well,
occur?
with the cookie analogy, we've got man breaks into house, walks through the house using his legs to propel him, and then he eats the cookies and walks out. And it's like, What? So you need a different level of evidence for evolution than someone breaking into your house and eating the cookies. Well, the eating the cookies event, it all happened rather quickly, and it's all the evidence is all there in front of your nose, so you can see it. With evolution, you have to look a bit harder. You need to dig up fossils. You need to understand, like, discover where they are, radiocarbon date them. You need to do all of this technological stuff and piece all the complex jigsaw puzzle together. But at the end of the day, you still got a similar picture. You've got, oh well, here's Homo erectus dated at 100,000 years ago, and then here's this blah blah blah, and like you can see the cranial development, the different the increase in the CCs of the brain from the skull fossils. You've got so much evidence that we can see transitional evidence, right, to the point
Yes,
where
but the point
it
is,
would be
the point
analogous to
you
saying
can't.
no, aliens came and painted the footprints.
Yeah, because the point is, you can't prove the transition. How are you
You can't
proving the
prove the
transition to
footprints.
me?
You can't prove aliens didn't paint the footprints.
Yeah, you can't. You're right. So that would be a viable alternative hypothesis. But we use abduction, right?
Yeah, but
To
would
to
it be a plausible one?
Well, that's because we know how footprints are created in a kitchen, right, or in a house. Muddy footprints. We have a mechanism for establishing that, right? We don't have a mechanism for establishing how one species gives rise to another. That's my whole contention. So you're applying this magical process without proof, right? And it's based in naturalistic philosophy, right? Because if you could prove, that's why I said at the start, if you could prove to me that speciation does and has and is occurring, then I would say the threshold has probably been met, or
I feel
possibly
like
been met.
I feel like you've slightly. I feel like at this point, I'm not sure if the goalposts have been moved. I feel like they have, because what I feel like we've agreed. Oh, I think you've agreed. Maybe we need to push harder on that if you haven't. But we've agreed that the theory of evolution is the most plausible explanation, not only by some, like there's some contenders and maybe it's slightly more. No, it's the only plausible explanation, and any other explanation, like the ones that you've offered, are less plausible, less parsimonious. It's the most plausible. We can see the intermediate fossils. We can see the gradients, the changes over time. We can radiocarbon date it. We have all the evidence. We have it's a nice jigsaw puzzle which fits together all
Mhm.
nicely. And to posit something different would be to do something unintuitive to the evidence that we have. So I agree with you that we might not know some particular technical mechanism, but we can see a very clear picture. And to posit something else would just be less
Yes.
parsimonious. And
Okay.
so, on that
So
grounds,
now,
I don't
what
see
I would
how
say.
it could be a religious, faith based like position when it's so clear.
Okay, because what I would argue now, for soldier, and we're going off sort of science into the philosophy of sort of religion, is that you are applying naturalistic philosophy, and you are applying a faith in naturalism to answer questions of history. Now, people will argue, well, atheism can't be a faith, right? But my contention would be that it is actually, because if so, for example, a theist could argue those previous species were created by God, right, and extincted by God, and he recreated new types periodically throughout history. So that theist is appealing to a religious faith, right? But
Yeah, and I agree.
yeah, you agree with that, but you're answering this question by appealing to a naturalistic faith, a
Yeah,
faith in naturalism, the
I'm,
idea
I'm
that everything
appealing.
has been created, everything on this planet has been created naturalistically. Now, that in itself is a faith. So that's my point. Evolutionary theory is a faith because you have to
Okay,
appeal to
right.
naturalistic philosophy.
So yeah, right. So now we've got to the point where you're saying, okay, so I agree with all of that. However, the induction in general, induction of the natural world. So basically, all empirical observations, all induction is a faith-based position. So if you're going to say that, then all science is a faith-based position. And if you're going to say that all science is a faith-based position, then I I wouldn't concede the debate proposition. I would just say that you've said something ridiculous. Like
Yeah, I
that's
agree.
the
No, no, that's a fair point. But for soldier, I'm not saying that all science is a faith-based position, because we're talking about induction is fine. I'm talking about abduction here, right? Induction is fine if you can prove something through the scientific method or verify it through the scientific method. That's fine. I agree. That's evidence and not faith. by our definition of what constitutes evidence earlier in the conversation. But my point is, when you're making a historical claim like Jesus was resurrected or this bacterium evolved into all species, right, then you have to appeal to faith, right? And your faith is either naturalism or supernaturalism, right? And you're appealing to naturalism to explain those phenomena.
I don't think it's such an easy dichotomy, right? You
Mhm.
can't just say, oh, well, either it's naturalism or it's supernaturalism. That doesn't seem to be um, something that you could hinge a debate win on.
Well, those are the two. Those are the two most accepted explanations, aren't they, for biodiversity? Creationism versus evolutionism, right?
Right, but you would then have to additionally argue that they're equally plausible, which you can't.
Well, that depends on your faith. That depends on your presupposition, isn't it? Whether God exists or doesn't exist, right?
Well, then could you make a that we're just going to have a conversation about the existence of God,
Exactly,
and
which I
that's
didn't want to go down. Yeah, exactly, which I didn't want to go down. But the point is I am making a distinction between evolutionary theory and other scientific theories. So I think it cut out at the beginning when I said this, but like the heliocentric theory, I would argue that has met the burden of proof. That's induction as well. Whatever the cell theory of life, all organisms are composed of cells. I accept that has met the burden of proof. So there are, scientific theories which I think have met that threshold and don't rely on faith. But my whole contention is that evolutionary theory is not one of them. It hasn't met that threshold, especially
right.
the
So,
historical of
but how is
evolution.
it possible that these other fields of inquiry pass your bar, but the evolutionary theory, can't because they're what are you saying? The heliocentric model passes the bar because we can observe
Yes.
the Earth going around the sun.
Yeah,
Well,
pretty
the
much.
theory of evolution, well, we can observe evolution through fossil records, but that doesn't pass your bar because you're saying that there's some mechanistic link that we don't have that invalidates our theory. But then I could just say, right, well, then you need to explain the Big Bang and the universe, like universal constants and the gravity and like all of the astrological physics, which we
Mhm.
don't quite yet have an answer for. We need to include in that as well, because if your bar means that we have to explain away we have to have full details of every process, then you don't quite know if the Earth goes around the sun. Maybe it's not quite heliocentric. Maybe in 14 years, uh, the sun's going to start going around the Earth or something. Do you know what I mean? Or maybe the
Yeah.
universe is spinning in such a way that the Earth is the center of the universe and the sun is going like all these like. Do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
you can't take one standard for one and another standard for another. If you're going to take one standard of skepticism for one, you have to take the same level of skepticism for the other.
No, yeah, I completely accept that. But it's not just based on observation, right? They've produced a heliocentric theory. They've produced a credible, workable model, right, which is verifiable, which is testable, which is observable. It's falsifiable, right? Einstein's law.
How is it testable if we can't see into the future? How do you know in 14 years it might change in 14 years? How do you know?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, scientific theories do change with time, isn't it? Newtonian
No,
mechanics,
I mean the
Einstein.
Earth. The Earth might change its orbit in 14 years. It might do something unexpected. How do you know? Because you're relying on induction. You can't know.
Yeah,
You're
oh,
relying
yeah,
on
yeah.
observation.
I understand Hume's problem of induction, right? We can't know the sun will rise tomorrow. You're right, but but the science doesn't work on that. Science works on the principle that we work with testable. We create workable models, right, to explain nature. Things could always change in the future. Yeah,
We
I
have a workable model. We have a workable model for how the jigsaw fits together with evolution. But you're having a different standard of
yeah.
evidence required. You
But,
need almost an omniscient level of knowledge of the
because
evolutionary process before you would accept it.
Yeah, because Footsoldier, but I don't believe we do have a workable model. That's my point. Look, all of the evidence today says that organisms within a species can reproduce and we can create variety within a species. And there is microevolution, small changes within a species. There is phenotype changes in phenotype frequency within a population. Right, natural selection occurs. I grant all of that, but there is not one shred of evidence to suggest that speciation can occur, that one species can give rise to another species, right? So that is the very thing which needs to be established if you're going to produce this model which says my ancestor was a bacterium. If you're going to make that claim, I would like to have a mechanism for how that process occurs, and that cannot be proven. That mechanism cannot be established or
Uh,
has not
the
been established.
or maybe some things have yet to be established. That doesn't invalidate all of the persuasive evidence, fossil records, and all of this that we have. So I feel now
Exactly. So at the
we've
start,
got
so I'll just clarify. At the start, remember, I did say I'm not saying evolutionary theory is false. I'm saying it's unproven. I made that distinction. So you're right. Perhaps it is true, but we just haven't
mm,
found the evidence. But that's
right, but
still not
that's not the debate proposition. The debate
true
proposition is that it's a faith-based position, right? So
because it's faith. Yeah, yeah. So if you think evolution is true, you're appealing to faith. That's my point. You're not appealing to evidence. You're appealing to faith. Just the same
no,
way
you
you
are
might.
appealing to the best evidence and the
No,
most
no.
persuasive evidence.
Well, let's say this foot soldier. Let's say those footprints. You've just seen those muddy footprints, and somebody's taken your cookie jar, some cookies out your cookie jar. You can't just say, "Oh, I think Boris Johnson did it." Right? Okay, why? Oh, because I've just got an idea of
That
Boris Johnson. That's
that's
faith. That
that's
would be
not
faith.
analogous. That's not analogous. It's like evolution. We can see all of the intermediary fossils lined up. We can say, oh, well, that evolved into that, that evolved into that. We don't really understand how it happened, but it's obviously the case because look, we can see it before our eyes. It's like the footsteps. It's like the cookie jar. There's like the crumbs around the cookie jar. We can see all the evidence there. We can see all the slowly morphing skeletal structures. We can see the incremental increases in CC of the brain, of the cranium. We can see all of these different things that are iterative changes over the fossil records, and then you want to say no, actually it's faith based to say that this somehow is all related. Oh no, and I think at that point it's so you haven't offered a plausible counter a plausible alternative explanation. The most plausible explanation is the theory of evolution by such a huge magnitude, with such it's so compelling with the not only the fossil record but the carbon dating, the all of the technology that we have. To
Mm.
dispute it, you would actually have to provide a more plausible, or at least equally plausible account, which you failed to do. I understand the issues with not fully having mechanisms of species divergence. That is a challenge for science, and they're working on it, right? And I agree that I can't generate any evidence on the spot right now for that. However, the debate proposition is contingent on it's about it being a faith-based position, and I think given adequate evidence for something, um, having the most fitting plausible account evidence which is very persuasive, that is not faith based at that point because it's not appealing to anecdotes, it's not appealing to some shady evidence from one person. It's appealing to the collective understanding of all of the fossil records and all of the scientists who have carbon dated it and done all of this. It fits together like a jigsaw. The shoe fits. So that's, for me, it's not faith based. I feel at this point that can be a closing statement for me.
Okay,
We can
fine.
take it to a vote because I don't feel like we're going to cover much more ground. I think that we've had an interesting discussion and we've reached a point where we are now starting to loop. So it's a nice point. Would you want to do a closing statement?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and before I do, I'll just say thanks, Footsoldier, for the conversation. Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it as well, and you have raised some very interesting points, which have given me some you know moments to consider, some thinking to do.
Cool, man.
But I will just end by saying, look, I think 500 years ago, right, the men in black robes would have told you that the reason all these organisms, all these species exist is because God created them. Now, the men in white lab coats tell you the reason all these organisms and species exist is because of evolution. They all descended from a single cell common ancestor. I personally do not see a distinction between these two claims. I don't think either of them are supported by solid evidence, and therefore that's why I conclude, that they are both faiths. Right now, I understand everybody has a difference in opinion on what the threshold is required to believe something as true or as faith. But I think with Western secular society today, evolutionism, which is grounded in naturalism, appears to be the new religion of the West. And I think everybody is appealing to naturalism to explain every single observation of nature. And that to me is a form of faith. But I wouldn't say that all of naturalism is a faith in itself. Like I said, the scientific method and induction can be used to prove things and to provide evidence. But when you appeal to naturalism to explain events which are well out of your realm of knowledge, which you can never know about, like, for example, a bacterium being, your ancestor from 3.8 billion years ago, I would say then that is appealing to faith. So there is a distinction there. I provided alternative naturalistic models, the alien hypothesis. I have also got others. I could produce multiple descent so that there were multiple common ancestors, and they all gave rise to different lineages. One, for example, to the plant kingdom, one to the animal kingdom, one to the fungi kingdom, whatever. So that would also refute evolutionary theory. And if you were to reject, the fact that you reject that one and accept yours is evidence of faith, in my opinion, because there's no evidence to support one over the other. So I think ultimately it does boil down to an issue of faith, which is why I've referred to it as that. And I think with that I will end the discussion. And once again, thanks for taking the time to discuss this with me.
Nice one, man. Yeah, it's been an interesting one, and glad that we could discuss this in a nice way, and we didn't interrupt each other and stuff like that. So it was a really nice one. Thanks, man.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks.